Hi, Tom.
Hey, Bob.
How you doing?
Terrific.
I bet that's an exaggeration, but we'll get to that. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. You're Thomas Friedman, very well-known author, foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times, winner of not one, not two, but three Pulitzer Prizes. Tom, is that the most Pulitzer Prizes anyone's ever won? And let me tell you just straight up, if you claim you haven't looked into this, I'm not going to believe you. So what is the
As far
answer?
as I know, the one time I
Yeah,
peeked,
yeah.
it is the most. There was a time when, in the early days of the Pulitzers, they gave them to each other on the board.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there may be someone with four, but I'm thrilled that.
Those don't count. We're not going to count those. Well, congratulations.
Thank you.
Listen, as you may have heard, we have a new president, and you and I are going to talk about his foreign policy to the extent that we can discern it, what causes there may be for concern, what causes there may be for hope. I personally don't feel suffused with optimism at the moment about the world. In fact, it's been a long time since I felt that way, but I feel even less that way since the inauguration. How are you feeling?
You know, there are a lot of things about the inauguration that disturb me on the domestic economic front. The of the many things that have happened in the last 48 hours, basically, whether it was the pardoning of the J6
Mm.
rioters, or today in a little notice thing, didn't get the attention I think it deserved, but Trump also lifted President Biden's you know regulation that allowed us to sanction violent West Bank settlers. And I was just thinking, like,
Mm.
why would you lift that? I mean, like,
Mm.
what is the constituency for that? Even about 12 people in Brooklyn. I mean, but it's just one of those things that goes by, and you just say, what for? Why would anyone support violent? You can be for or against settlements, but where's the for violent settlers?
Mhm.
Constituency in America. Anyways, there's that. What worries me today of the announcements, Bob, as we speak, is that this whole attack on the EV industry, because it actually just came from China, and not just, but I mean, I was there 6 weeks ago, and the most interesting thing for me, I've tried to be a regular visitor to China almost every year, except during COVID. And last time I was there, Xiaomi was a Chinese smartphone company. And I came back and they were a car company, EV company.
Mhm. Mhm.
Huawei was a smartphone company. I came back, they were an EV company. BYD, their big battery company, was a battery company. I came back, they were a car company. Why is this important? Because basically an EV is a smartphone with wheels. And that the progression we're on. I have a daughter who lives in San Francisco, and there's nothing I love more than going to San Francisco, other than seeing my daughter, my son-in-law, my grandson, is riding in Waymos. I love riding in Waymos. I'm
Mhm.
completely addicted. And Waymos are clearly going to be the wave of the future. That is autonomous driving cars. The only way you get to autonomous vehicles is through EVs, because you can't have autonomous vehicles that go into gas stations. Okay, so there's a very clear progression here, sort of plug-in electric hybrids, EVs, and then autonomous cars. If we take ourselves, Bob, out of that progression, we are in effect turning over the future of the automobile industry to the Chinese.
Well, I would assume that Trump's kind of political incentives, given his proximity to Elon Musk, are to put up barriers to Chinese imports, but do nothing to impede Tesla.
Yeah, and what he did today was, what the regulation he signed is to remove the subsidy, $7,500 for every Tesla car, in effect. So
Yeah,
I'm
although I've been told Musk doesn't especially mind it because he's gotten the benefit of that.
right.
And now the any smaller American EV companies are the ones who are going to be hurt more.
Right.
Any rising competitors. So if Trump puts up the trade barriers to China, then Musk is sitting pretty.
I'm sure he's done that math. But as far as America is concerned, this is to make China great again, because they will ultimately dominate the electric vehicle industry, and that is the future. And that's why Germany is in turmoil now. And that is, I mean, I've talked to CEOs in Detroit, and they will tell you the most frightening thing. They need technology transfer from China today to make batteries, to make cutting edge
Mhm.
batteries. And so this just strikes me as one of these gratuitous things. Like, it'd be just so easy to say all of the above. Let's have EVs. You want to have a gas guzzler, you want to drive a Ram, whatever you want, But why single out the thing that is clearly going to be an essential part of the transportation mobility future? It's that kind of
Well,
gratuitous stuff. Yeah.
there is an answer to that.
Yeah.
Trump has been known to associate with people in the oil industry.
Yes.
That's part of the answer. And he's got this kind of I guess I guess Burkean conservatism isn't quite the right term, but gas guzzlers are traditional
Yeah.
in America, and
Well, maybe it's
so
part of that Mark Zuckerberg kind of manly thing, that he's introduced, but
yeah, it's cowboy conservatism kind of.
um,
Can I ask you about China more broadly? I mean,
please.
Trump, in some ways, he and his supporters like Steve Bannon helped begin the slide in U.S.-China relations to the pretty low point they're at now. Something that concerns me a lot, and I think is the opposite of smart in the context of the artificial intelligence revolution, whereas some people think it's like a brilliant AI strategy. I won't bore you with my views on that, but what do you think the prospects are that Elon Musk, or maybe some other force, but I would think Musk is the most likely source of encouragement for engagement with China, just given Musk's own business
Yeah,
interests in
yeah,
China?
because
What
he
do
has
you
a
think?
yeah,
Yeah.
he has a yeah.
So do you think we could be surprised and Trump could wind up doing, some kind of rapprochement with China?
It's interesting. And I wrote this when I was in China, which is that the Chinese call Trump Deng Xiaoping. They say Trump is the closest thing Americans have to Deng Xiaoping. And what was Deng Xiaoping's most famous statement? Black cat, white cat, don't care. All that matters is that it catches mice. And so they see him in that kind of mold of, transactional deal maker. And I
Hmm.
would say they were relatively calm, relatively about him coming in, but for two reasons. One, which Trump will discover, which is that in the 3 years of COVID, when no one was going to China, and then the years after COVID, when we deliberately disengaged from China. So all these American business executives who were in China actually left during COVID, and virtually none came back. So I actually had a feeling I've never had in China on this trip. I felt like I was the only American in the country.
Yeah.
So there's like no Americans there. And what's been missed, I believe, is that the Chinese, well, again, I mentioned this in the column, they see Trump as their Sputnik. That the threat of tariffs and whatnot did for them what Sputnik did for us under Eisenhower, which is to launch our own sort of highway system and advanced manufacturing and ultimately the internet. And so I find the Chinese actually relatively calm about him because they have actually gone a long way. They're in a much stronger position than they were back when he started, number one. Number two, they see him as transactional and
Hmm.
that they feel somewhere we're going to find a deal with this guy. They don't see him as he's not interested in Uyghurs, he's interested in
Hmm.
tariffs. And that for them is a better place to start the conversation.
Yeah, and it's not like you could have a harsher tech war than Biden.
Exactly.
Basically, he didn't quite launch it. It was, in some sense, continuous with Trump's own policy, but it was so amped up.
Yeah.
And I think there are more and more signs that it's at best not working, and at worst will boomerang. But they may feel that they can get some of those restrictions released because Trump will bargain, as you
Yeah.
say.
That's how they see
I
it.
mean,
Yeah.
relaxed and not released. Yeah. So do you think that's one of the China is one because you and I are both pro engagement. And so do you
Which is a
think,
minority view.
oh my God, it's
It's
unbelievable.
yeah,
This
yeah,
so-called China
yeah,
consensus, it
yeah,
happened so fast. And
yeah.
now in tech, you've got this kind of dynamic where in the AI community, there's a strong incentive for everyone lobbying on behalf of the AI industry, the tech industry broadly, to say that China is this menace. And so you have to give the government has to subsidize AI and their energy and completely release them from regulation and so on. And then there are also true believer China hawks in the tech community in Silicon Valley, but a certain amount of it's coming out of there. Anyway, you're right. This is
and for me, it's just, if I just say it's just common sense, which is draw red lines where you need to and build bridges where you can. It just doesn't seem to me. I don't think of myself as a hawk or a dove or whatever. It just seems to be common sense.
Now, do you think this is one of the areas where there is the most cause for hope? I mean, we will turn shortly to, for example, Panama and Greenland, and also the Middle East, and I hope we have time to talk about Ukraine. But do you think in a weird way, because China did almost start things off in terms of the worsening of Chinese relations with China, do you think this may be one of the more hopeful areas?
I'm agnostic on it, which is to say I'm not pessimistic or I'm not optimistic either. But I just think Trump. What I do every morning when I get up after I have my breakfast and whatnot is I fire up CNBC and I look at the 10-year bond.
Everybody needs a hobby.
That's right. First thing I do, and it's up, I don't know, 120 basis points or so since Trump was elected, and it's just a proxy for basically tariffs on the world, i.e., inflation, more inflation, higher oil prices, and evicting 11 million immigrants. And so I find one of the reasons I've been fairly relatively zen about this moment is I've kind of given up on politics of late, but I still really believe in physics. And the physics of these things are going to be restraining. And so somewhere between the physics and the politics, my guess is we'll find a solution.
What do you mean by that? The physics will be restraining?
I mean, the fact is, if you put up tariffs of 25%, inflation's going to happen. If you evict 11 million immigrants that people need to operate so many businesses, inflation is going to happen. And so there is the physics of things. I'm the same way on the Middle East, and we'll get to it. But 7 million Jews can't control 7 million Palestinians. Okay, I mean, somewhere the physics of that's going to break.
Yeah, I do think he may have kind of lucked out. Last time he's lucky because he started with such low inflation that he could cut taxes without it hurting him big time along that dimension. This time he may get some help from. I think you're going to start seeing non-trivial productivity gains from AI by halfway through his term at the latest. And
I'm totally with you.
That may neutralize some of the inflationary effect of his other policies. But I hope somebody will talk some sense to him on tariffs. And I hope somebody will explain to his constituency that they're the ones who suffer. Low and middle income Americans pay the price for that.
Totally.
And it's just not going to bring back many jobs.
Well, the other thing, what was so interesting, what I learned in China on this trip was a term I'd never heard before. A Chinese diplomat told me that she had gone out to buy a bed, and she had a friend who knew a guy at the bed factory. So she went out to the bed factory, and it was completely dark. And she discovered the term dark factory. And China is now full of dark factories. They're entirely roboticized, so they don't turn on the lights or heat. And the engineers only come at 2 a.m. to basically clean the machines. So the old joke about the modern American factory will just be a man and a dog. The man will be there to feed the dog, and the dog will be there to keep the man away from the machines. That's actually coming true. Now, what's interesting is one of the trade-offs in the U.S.-China thing, as we stick on that, is that the Chinese may say, well, we'll build factories in Ohio. Oh, but just one thing, they'll all be robotic, and we can control them from here. So the modern, this is the other side of the AI productivity that I think people haven't fully absorbed, which is that it's not exactly good for factory workers.
Yeah, no, I just think AI is going to be an earthquake, and it's going to be very, quite possibly socially destabilizing. It's going to just introduce so many new elements in so many realms, including a lot of job turnover. And at best, I mean, that's assuming that there are new jobs to find. And so I just think the idea that we need to accelerate, the pace of AI development is nuts. I mean, the slower, the better. And there's no way you can really stop it or even slow it down. But the idea that the government should subsidize it to speed it up. And the only justification for that, that it rhetorically, that has effect is China, China,
Yeah.
China. They
Yeah.
are telling us we have to speed up the pace, the road to what I think is going to be non-trivial destabilization because of this imagined, in my view, largely imagined threat from China. But so let's so you wrote a column about a few weeks ago after Trump said the stuff about Panama and Greenland, and now in addition, I guess he's talking about military strikes on drug trafficking gangs inside Mexico. He's designated them terrorist groups, further fuzzing up the question of what we mean when we say terrorist. The and you know you are very much against invading countries and seizing
Mhm.
their territory. It's I heard Ian Bremmer interviewed the other day. I'm sure
Huh.
you know Ian,
Oh, yeah, I like that, yeah.
and he was saying, it's just it's a big mistake for America to return to the law of the jungle, in part because Trump's not going to be president forever. Like what we need is the enduring stability of some kind of rules-based order. Now, if I had been speaking into his ear, I would have said, well, don't act like Trump is the first American leader to undermine the rules-based order. My stick on that.
Yeah.
But uh, he is taking it to a new level. He is, I would say, he is explicitly rejecting the rules-based order, whereas past presidents have ostensibly paid allegiance to it while often undermining it. In fact, but he is explicitly rejecting it, and the thing he's saying he'll do that truly would be new is like using military force to actually acquire territory, not just leave troops there and have some kind of de facto empire, but actually take the land. I mean, this is new stuff.
Yeah, in that little piece I did on that, I said, "What's the joke going around among China specialists?" How does Xi Jinping feel when he reads that Trump wants to seize Greenland? And the answer is hungry.
Mm.
Hungry for Taiwan. And so it just really is an open invitation for him to seize Taiwan, which has a heck of a lot more linguistic, historical, cultural affinity with mainland China than Americans do with Greenlanders.
Hmm.
I just think it opens up a whole um, uh, new level of craziness in the world that we forget, one of the things about this world, one of the questions I get most these days about is people will say to me, well, let me just tell you the backstory. I was in China a year ago before this trip, and I was speaking at a conference. So I was met by a young intern from the conference at the airport, and we were just standing around waiting for my luggage to arrive. And she said to me, "Mr. Friedman, I have to ask you, is the world still flat?" And I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, it's flatter than ever in the way I meant it, which is that technology had created this platform where more people could compete, connect, and collaborate in more ways on more days over more things for less money with greater ease than ever before." But she thought about that, and I could see I hadn't convinced her. And then about 10 minutes later, we kept talking. She said at one point, "Mr. Friedman, I used ChatGPT last weekend." I said, "You use ChatGPT on your VPN from Beijing, and you're asking me if the world is flat?"
Hmm.
So the point is that what we've learned over the last 2 decades, I would say since the late 1990s, is that uh, we've basically wired the world together, greased the connections more than ever, and then took out the buffers, regulatory and other. And therefore, instability in one place gets transmitted to the whole system just so much faster and more efficiently than ever before. And
Mhm.
so we saw it with Ukraine. Would be Taiwan would be in spades. And so if we start doing these things, the idea that, well, we just get to wake up one day, Greenland's ours, and that doesn't actually just completely reverberate through the system in ways that are completely unpredictable, I think is a real fantasy.
And do you know exactly what's going through his head? So in Greenland, like we have a military base, okay? So it's
Yeah.
not like
Oh yeah.
China or Russia is going to come like take
No.
it out of our
Yeah.
sphere of influence.
And
Okay,
it's in NATO.
we have military base.
Yeah.
Now, Panama, I looked into this a little. He says China's running it. So apparently what happened in 1996, Panama solicited contracts for a company to operate the canal. There were 3 bidders, Bechtel in the U.S., one other one, and a company in Hong Kong. A company in Hong Kong got the contract, and they're still running it. And it hasn't been a problem until
Yeah.
Trump turned it into one. I don't know. Look, I don't doubt that China is trying to, the government uses that in some ways to, I don't know, further whatever it can further within the constraints of, a company that operates the Panama Canal. But then Trump also says, but again, there's, there's no way they're going to, like, if they tried to shut the canal, come take the canal, look, it's closer to us than to them. We cared about a lot. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
And I don't even know what he's talking about when he says that the rates discriminate against U.S. I'll look into it. I'd be surprised. I mean,
Yeah.
so on these 2 things, now, yes, Greenland has these rare earth minerals and a lot of resources, but again, we have military bases. What have you heard anything about how this part of his brain started?
This one really feels like it started at the Mar-a-Lago bar.
Yeah. And he doesn't drink. That's the
That's
scary.
right. Which is why the guys who are drunk, probably applied it on him. But I'm pretty sure, I don't have my Google machine on right now, but I'm pretty sure Haifa Port is run by a Chinese port company, Haifa
Yeah.
Port in Israel. So, and I'm pretty sure San Diego, one of our ports, is controlled by Dubai. So, I mean, this is actually a global business running ports. It's done by some of the best companies in the world. And if they were in the business of biasing, what went in and out of those ports to their home country, there wouldn't be a business today. So
we'd have heard about it. I think
yeah.
It's disturbing that
Yeah.
he may not himself understand what the real story is.
Well, when I was in China, I mean, a lot of Chinese, interlocutors said to me, "So what's Trump going to do on trade?"
Mhm.
And I said, "I have no idea, but there's only one thing I can guarantee you. I don't think they've done an 80-page study in advance.
Yeah.
A lot of this just feels so seat of the pants."
So, I mean, there's a chance he'll get distracted and half of this stuff will fall by the way, but he's repeating some of it on a fairly regular basis.
But then Mexico was going to pay for the wall too, and that kind of went by the wayside
Yeah.
also.
As did the wall the first time
Yeah.
around. Maybe that'll finally happen.
Yeah.
So what else? Middle East. So you wrote a column came out, I think today, maybe, or yesterday.
Today.
So your kind of memo to Trump, you didn't put it quite like that, but I think you're talking to him when you say your interest is to bring Israel and Saudi Arabia into U.S.-led alliance with our other Arab partners, and that will require Israel to open talks on a 2-state solution with the Palestinian Authority. And you explain why Netanyahu will resist this. So let's start with first principles. Why is it important to bring, to reach this next level of the Abraham Accords where Saudi Arabia comes into the fold and recognizes Israel?
So let me start at a really high level of abstraction, how I look at the world. If you asked me, Bob, this is very non-zero. If you said, what do you think is the best thing that happened in your journalism career? I would tell people, I think the best thing that happened in the world in my career was the creation of the European Union. That a continent known from time immemorial for tribal, religious, sectarian wars created the largest center of free markets, free people, the rule of law, and human rights. That I am of that lucky American generation that gets to live in a world of 2 United States and not just one. It's a different, obviously, entity than ours, but basically, directionally, it's the same thing. And Americans will do anything for the European Union except read about it. But it actually is an incredibly important and valuable institution. And it is actually my model, what I call the complex adaptive coalition, for global governance in the era we're going into. Now, my vision for the Middle East is that my hope for the Middle East, in fact, my belief that the only hope for the Middle East is if it finds its way to a Middle Eastern European Union. And I believe the Saudi-Israel axis, based on Israel also opening relations with the Palestinian Authority on a 2-state solution, opening talks, is the foundational axis for that. We're attached in the Abraham Accords to that, to Oslo. And then you've basically got a coalition really starting with Japan, Philippines, Korea, across India, through the Middle East up into Europe. So that's where I'm coming from. It is not some. It's connected to a view of the world. You can agree with it or disagree with, but that's where I'm coming from.
Okay. So, and you also say that, let's see. Okay. So back to Netanyahu, you write Netanyahu's political survival will keep his coalition in power, forestall any national inquiry commission over who was at fault for the Hamas surprise attack on his watch. Depends on the Gaza war resuming after this ceasefire and Bibi never opening time-bound negotiations with the Palestinian Authority on two states for two peoples. So, I guess we've talked about this before. I don't, at this point, see any way a two-state solution actually happens, and I certainly don't think an agreement by Israel to start on the path is going to result in anything. You know, Mohammed bin Salman, I think, actually said, so he's the heir apparent de facto ruler in Saudi Arabia, and he said some months ago, I think, for the first time, he said, we're not going to normalize relations with Israel. He didn't say path to two-state. He said, until there's a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem. Now, I doubt he'll stick with that, but it seems to me that's almost the only way it happens. Essentially, he's holding the cards here, right? And not that I think he cares about the Palestinians, but he has his political reasons to be seen as someone who cares about the Palestinians. I don't know how strong the reasons are, honestly. I don't understand Middle Eastern politics well enough. But I mean, I guess what I'm kind of saying is I'm having trouble imagining a Middle Eastern version of the European Union without the Palestinian problem in some sense solved. And I just don't see a solution in the cards anymore. I've been to the West Bank. I'm sure you've been to the West Bank. And the capsule version of my assessment is you can't unscramble the egg. And leave aside the fact that since October 7th, 2023, Israel has entered a state of mind that makes it even less hospitable to the kind of two-state solution that would be probably the minimum that Palestinian leaders could accept and go back and explain and justify to their people. So I just, I don't know. What do you reassure me? Help me out.
Well, I will tell you, I'm motivated by a couple of things. One is that when I write these things, there are people who are less kind than you and will say that I'm Friedman, you're delusional. So my first reaction is to say, oh my God, you mean it's hard? I had no idea. Thank you for explaining that to me. But let me explain something to you. There is probably, Bob, maybe a 5% chance this can happen anymore. But I'm going to devote 100% of my energy to that 5%, because I think the alternative is not a one-state solution, not a three-state solution, not a binational solution. I think the alternative is actually a no-state solution. No states for two people, which is to say a forever war. And since I'd like to try to forestall that, I'm going to continue pressing down this road. I confess, and I've confessed this before, I have an ulterior motive. Because I believe if Saudi Arabia and the Trump administration were to create a context where if Israel just opened negotiations with the PA on a two-state solution, it would blow up Netanyahu's coalition. Because I believe this is the worst Israeli government in the history of the Jewish people's presence in the land of Israel. Okay, anything that blows it up and can create an alternative is a good thing in and of itself. So for those reasons, I'm pushing both, and I will continue to push both. And I do it also with the awareness this is not my first rodeo, not my first Israeli-Palestinian war. And I cannot tell you, I'm now 71. I've been doing this since I was 15. How many times I've heard people say, "That's it, that's it. They're terrible. They're awful. They're monsters." Never. Yeah. And then the smoke clears, and people realize you cannot live in a state of permanent war, and they look for alternatives. Remember, Oslo, came about after the first Intifada, and the Barak Peace Initiative, after actually presaged it, but it's never over as far as I'm concerned, unless you believe that you're ready to see all the good people leave on both sides and move to Canada and Miami, and just leave the worst people there. That may be where we end up, but I'm going to use my pen to keep putting these ideas out there, because I think it's just really important. And if people can call me whatever naive things they want, I'm hardly naive. I get what's going on, but I've said this, to and about the campus protesters last year, which is that if you have a chant for your cause that takes you 15 minutes to explain why it doesn't mean what it obviously means, from the river to the sea, then I suggest you get a different chant. Let me suggest one. 2 states for 2 people. It works really well with drums, by the way. 2 states for 2 people, okay? Because that's the only way out of this.
I think a lot of the protesters, well, I assume, like me, just no longer consider a 2-state solution to have even a 5% chance. Now, there's more to it than that, of course. I mean, the internal dynamics of the protest movement are a story of their own.
Yes.
But I don't blame people for just who just kind of stopped talking about a 2-state solution. In terms of the rhetoric, by the way, Norm Finkelstein, whom you certainly know of. Do you know him personally?
I don't know him personally.
I had him on my podcast. Very fun guy. Anyway.
More fun than me.
It's so close. People often ask me, Bob, who's the funnest person you know? And I say, I'll tell you. Oddly, it's these 2 Jewish guys.
These crazy Jews
who have different views of Israel, very different views of Israel. But anyway, no. What he went to Columbia and addressed the protesters and said you would be better off saying, not from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. From the river to the sea, Palestinians will be free. Even that, I thought, was a. I think
I know what he's saying. Interesting.
Yeah, no, the difference. It's. I think leave aside the river to the sea part. Just saying Palestinians, rather, I think freaks people out less. Yeah. Anyway, all that aside. Yeah, look, there are very few protest movements that, in my view, pursue the optimal public relations strategy. But, let's see. So what is, I guess, do you agree with me that you can't really imagine the EU version of the solution in the Middle East broadly without a solution to the Palestinian people that is perceived as like enduringly acceptable to them and is perceived as fair to?
Well, not only do I agree with you, but I see you one and raise you one. I just think it's impossible, and that's why it's always been the keystone for me of everything I've ever written. It has got to be at the center of this, and everyone who tries to go around it has failed and will continue to fail. That also has obligations for Palestinians to do what they need to do to advance that and make it possible as well. But it's the centerpiece, always has, always will be.
Mm-hmm. Then there's the question of, well, as you've suggested, whether Israel will play ball. And, you put it in terms of whether Netanyahu will play ball. I would ask the larger question. Is Israel in any mood to play ball, especially after October 7th? I mean, it seems to me more than ever that the governing assumption of Israel's national security policy is that the world is always going to hate us, and we just have to make sure that none of our potential enemies have enough firepower. So just wipe out their capacity and do it again and again. And I think more than ever that is kind of the mindset. Do you think that's a mischaracterization?
I think it's a mindset today. I do believe Israelis are still traumatized about October 7th as long as the hostages are there. And I think once the hostages are out, if you can get some kind of stable ceasefire, I think you will see the emergence of different voices. Because I talk to these guys all the time. I just talked to two, very senior Israeli security officials today about my column and said, thank you for putting that out. We've got a very similar plan. So I think you're underestimating what could happen once this crisis of Gaza is some way neutralized. You know, Bob, again, because I've been doing this for a long time. You know, in 2002, I was the midwife for the Saudi, what was the Saudi Peace Initiative, which then by King Abdullah in an interview with me, and then there was an Arab League meeting called in Beirut at the end of March to actually take his interview and turn it into the Arab Peace Initiative. So this was the first meeting of the Arab League to actually put down a two-state solution plan, full trade normalization for two people. People forget what happened on the first night of that summit. A Hamas suicide bomber walked into a Passover Seder in Netanya and blew himself up, killing a lot of people and wounding many, many more. Now, when you think of like awful things, that to me is on the awful scale. That's kind of up there, awful with what happened on October 7th. And so I've just seen a lot of these things to both sides of things Israelis have done to Palestinians. I covered the Lebanon war. And I just feel that there is a reason people keep coming back to these ideas because there is no other way.
Mm-hmm. And as for the prospects that Trump will wind up doing something you consider constructive in the Middle East and with Israel specifically, you mentioned, he's, I guess, removed these sanctions on violent West Bank settlers. Not a great sign. I should say that as the ceasefire has taken hold, and I'm not sure it has entirely, there's been continued some more killing, I think, but the West Bank, the aggressive, it seems, I gather, aggressive Israeli action's been ramped up in the West Bank. I assume that's partly Bibi balancing the domestic political scales. But in any event, Trump's not going to complain about that because Trump is all about appearance. I think it's good that he feels it's his ceasefire because then he will want the ceasefire per se to endure. And that's good.
Yeah.
But
very good point.
But it's not like he gives a shit about anything other than appearance. I mean, the other thing is he does want the Abraham Accords.
Yeah.
And that's why I say, MBS holds, I think, a lot of cards here. He could probably play some pretty hard ball with especially with Trump apparently willing to actually use leverage with Israel. We don't know for sure yet. But
also you have to understand there may be a move for Netanyahu. I'm just making this up, where basically the president of Israel agrees to pardon him. He abandons his right wing, does the Saudi deal, does something with the Palestinians, and gets the meta get out of jail card he needs, which is that everyone has to resign because of October 7th except him. The chief of staff of the Israeli army resigned today, as did the chief of the Southern Command. And so, and of course, that really everyone's
in atonement for October 7th.
Yeah, and so people are saying that. Well, what about you? You were prime minister, and so they will come for him. And that's another reason he doesn't want the war to end, because once the war ends, the president of Israel today said we need a commission of inquiry. So anything is possible. Is my feeling, and I'm just not foreclosing any options, but I am going to continue to put these ideas out there, because of the encouragement I get also from people there to please keep doing it.
Well, so on balance, what do you think the chances are that Trump will? Let me put it this way. I think so. So you see your larger vision of a constructive future for the Middle East being dependent on ultimately solution of the Palestinian issue. You put the chances of that, at least a two-state version of that, at 5%. Has your number gone up or down? Is your number now higher or lower than it was under Biden for, let's just say, chances of the constructive future you hope for?
It's a little bit higher, only because I have a lot of admiration for Joe Biden and what he tried to do in the Middle East, but he didn't have the vigor for it, and so they just didn't take him seriously. I was saying this in a podcast I actually did for the New York Times. When I was a kid growing up in Minnesota, at the state fair when I was like 5, they had a guy who could guess your weight. And if you guessed your weight within like 2 or 3 pounds, he won something, you won something. I don't even remember what it was. But as a 5-year-old kid, Bob, I was just in awe of that. How could he guess your weight? Well, in the Middle East, people can guess your power from 100 miles away because their life depends on it. And they smelled something about Biden, and they smell something different about Trump. And that's just a fact. And so I do think because of that, and remember, to go back quickly to the Abraham Accords, because it's really important. What I'm saying to you isn't just rooted in just some broad impression. What happened with the Abraham Accords? Very quickly, Bibi Netanyahu for years told every American president and secretary of state, test me, just test me. I'll test me.
Mm-hmm.
I'll surprise you. Okay. Well, comes along Jared Kushner, and he kind of accidentally tests Netanyahu. How? He gives him the map and says, you draw the lines. What would work for you politically? So he says, well, we annex 30% of the West Bank. All the settlements get to stay. Palestinians get 70%, demilitarized, some capital, within spitting distance of Jerusalem. I mean, totally pro-Israeli, pro-Netanyahu, whatever. That becomes the peace plan. Trump puts it out. And what happens? Netanyahu couldn't accept Netanyahu's own plan because his right-wing cabinet wouldn't go for it. So he was completely up a tree. Along comes Yusuf Al-Otaiba, the UAE ambassador to Washington, with a ladder. He says to Bibi, hey, will you come down that tree? If you come down that tree and agree to no annexation in the West Bank, we will do the Abraham Accords with you. Now, in between, a very important thing happened. Before that ladder was put up at the tree, David Friedman, Trump's ambassador to Israel, no relation, as they say, told Bibi, you just annex your 30%. Because you agree with this. Forget about the Palestinians. And Trump and Kushner, most importantly, Trump, said, sorry, Bibi, you only get your 30 if you recognize a Palestinian state on the 70. And by the way, the Trump peace plan also has very interesting ideas about Gaza. It was to expand Gaza actually into the Negev with pieces of the Negev. Again, none of this was accepted by either party at the time, but Trump is actually the only president who put down a real map for a two-state solution with his name on it. And so my feeling is we should, and this is what I've been arguing to Palestinians, treat it as the floor, not the ceiling, but just say, we want to start, Mr. Trump, with your plan. That's our floor. Now let's negotiate.
Yeah, well, I do think the only way for this to happen is for America to actually be more specific about a plan than I think it's generally been.
Well, actually, I have a different thought. If I could just say, what I'm really thinking more about is that, and because the questions you raised and Israelis raised about security after October 7, I totally get, and they're very real. Which is what I believe is that we can no longer solve this problem at the scale we've been trying to solve it at. Which is, I believe, the only way to solve it. And you saw the beginnings of this in southern Lebanon with the deal that we worked out there to get Hezbollah out of southern Lebanon, the Lebanese army in. For the first time, we have an American general based now in Beirut supervising that ceasefire. And my own general feeling is the only way you're going to solve this is with NATO troops on the Gaza border, the West Bank border, the Lebanon border, that there'll be never enough ability to trust one another after all that's happened now here, and it's going to take a trusted third party. So it cannot be solved at the scale it was solved before. That is the legacy of October 7.
Okay. Quickly, one more thing about Israel. You write in this column today that the nuclear program of Iran needs to be eliminated. I hope you can do it through peaceful negotiations. Otherwise, it needs to be done kinetically. Before I ask my question, I would like to register a note of dissent. Like, if you're Iran, like the way you look at this is, wait a second, we had a deal, we negotiated a deal. You had these, inspectors, monitors. We were, the enrichment level was very low. Everything was under control. Trump withdrew from the deal. America reneged on the deal. And now you're saying because of that, you're going to bomb us? Wait a second. That doesn't register. And I would just say, I'm totally not on board with America helping Israel bomb Iran. But what my ultimate question is, do you think Trump will wind up helping Israel bomb? My understanding is that there's only so much damage Israel can do to the nuclear program without active American military support. So they want the active support. They'll be using American weapons in any event. My ultimate question is going to be, what do you think the chances, do you think Trump will ultimately do that in the absence of a negotiated settlement? And I would just say that given that Trump is the guy who pulled the rug out from under the existing deal, I'd be kind of surprised if he.
I think Trump will make every effort, and then another effort to negotiate some kind of deal with the Iranians. But I think it will be a much more stringent deal than last time. And I would simply say that, of course, I completely opposed Trump tearing up the deal. I thought it was insane. But I just have another beef with Iran. And it's not just about how it treats its own people, but Iran has basically fostered four failed states in the region: Lebanon, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq isn't a failed state yet, by inserting and cultivating proxies outside the governing authority in those countries. One in particular that I happen to be very close to, Lebanon, okay, for the sole purpose, basically, of hiring Arab Shiites to kill Arab Sunnis in order to expand Iranian power and put a stranglehold around Israel's neck. So I have a problem with Iran that has nothing to do with Israel. For what they did to Lebanon was a travesty, and what they helped do to Syria, what the stranglehold they put Iraq in, and not to mention the forces they've encouraged in Yemen. So I happen to think they're just a really malign actor, and I don't believe that Israel can bomb out their nuclear reactor alone. I hope that we can do it by negotiation. It can only be done by the United States. But if this Iranian regime is curtailed, I think that is a very good thing. Forget Israel. I follow Lebanese politics very closely. Okay, that without Iran playing a more constructive role in Lebanon, it's not going to be able to get out of its rut right now. And so I just think something's got to happen there.
That Lebanon is not.
Yeah, and I think Syria not either, but Lebanon in particular, because the Shia. I happen to know a lot about, obviously, what's going on in Lebanon. I think they've got a really good new president now. They have an amazing new prime minister, Nawaf Salam, someone I've known for a long time. This is Lebanon's best chance, Bob, to end what is now a 50-year civil war, basically, what started in 1975. The only way it can happen is if the Shia are ready to play. They're the plurality in the country, basically. I believe they should be given whatever their fair share, and then in the sort of governing framework in Lebanon, but not to have their own private militia called Hezbollah, because it serves Iran's interest to be able to dictate Lebanese politics. Mm-hmm. So give the Lebanese a break, because if Lebanon works, then Syria has a better chance of working. And if Syria works, it actually improves conditions in Iraq. So, because what happened after the Iranians got beat up, very interesting. We had 2,500 troops in Iraq, and the Iraqis were being under Iranian pressure, were being forced to send them out. The Iraqis want them there. We helped train them, help them fight ISIS. And we were on the way out. As soon as that Iranian grip was weakened, the Iraqis said, hey, come on back. You don't have to go. So my vision of a Middle East European Union, I'd love the Iranians to be in it. I'm not for regime change. That's for somebody else. But I believe they have been a particularly malign actor in the region. Every bit as I believe Israel is a malign actor in the West Bank. So it's
it's a long and complicated issue. I mean, first of all, if I were to apportion responsibility for destabilizing states in the region, I would certainly bring the U.S. and Israel into the conversation. I mean, Hezbollah began after Israel invaded Lebanon and so on. U.S. and Iraq, U.S. and Libya, and I would say, what are the fruits of our proxy intervention in Syria? Well, maybe it'll work out. We'll see. But it's been a long and bloody path.
Let's double click on Syria for a second. It's important because that really wasn't us. That was really the Turks, and that was.
We played it. We played a role. We sent weapons. We had proxies.
but not really very much. Not at the stage. Yeah. Not in this last stage. I would disagree with that. And that was really autonomous. I mean, that was a lot driven by Syrians, and I think Syria too has the best chance now. I think we should be, as I said in my column, we should be in there with both hands, working with this new leader who's an Islamist, ex-Al Qaeda. I don't care, because he's shown himself at least willing to consider building a Syria on really pluralistic grounds. And I think the only future, by the way, of these countries, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, is you've got to find a power sharing agreement that has Islamists in it as well. All these efforts to purge the Islamists, okay? By the way, I believe a Hamas that's ready to lay down its weapons and join Oslo, I have no problem if they're in the Palestinian government. In fact, I think they should be and have to be, because they are, that's like saying Americans can't have evangelicals in their political system, okay?
There was a moment when that might have been doable some years ago, but during the civil war in Gaza, but go ahead.
Anyway, so I believe that we've got a big chance in all these countries now, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, better than we've ever had before. But it is going to require the Iranians to take a step backwards.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say is, Iran, I mean, Israel has radically less reason to be concerned about Iran now than it did a year and a half ago. You agree?
Yeah, no question.
I mean, and that's why I kind of wonder about, like, Israel is, bombing Syria. I mean, since the fall of the Assad regime, I wondered about it before, but we won't get into that. But since the fall of the Assad regime, bombing Syria to make sure it has no military capacity. I mean, it seems to me it was already pretty clear Iran had lost its land bridge to Hezbollah, and I
thought that was excessive. I've told Israelis they should actually be building a giant field hospital in the Golan, more than bombing, military facilities.
But do you get how when you give your characterization of Iran, there is a perspective from which, to some, Arabs and Iranians, you can list a lot of things Israel has done that look as gratuitously destabilizing as the things that you see in Iran?
Yeah. What I would say, Bob, is if I didn't have a almost 50-year record of challenging Israel on its gratuitous activities, you'd have a case. But I'm not AIPAC, okay? I'm someone who's actually called out Israel on all these activities.
Yeah, but you're not advocating bombing them.
No, because I don't think they deserve to be bombed, but I do believe, and for me, my problem with the Iranians is not what they do to Israel. First and foremost, it's what they do to their own people, this regime. Killed 550 women, okay, for not wearing headscarves. So I think the Middle East would be just a hell of a lot better with a different Israeli government and with a different Iranian government.
And that's probably true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I agree.
And I've been doing everything I can in my column to engineer both. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I like your approach better than some approaches, regime change. Quickly, we got just a couple of minutes. Any thoughts on Ukraine under Trump?
I think Trump will discover that he and Putin, like he and Bibi, are not aligned. Bibi wants to stay in power. Trump wants to win a Nobel Prize. Putin wants to win in Ukraine. Trump wants peace in Ukraine, so to be quiet and you can ignore it. And so I think there's not an alignment of interests there. I saw somewhere, it went by me, I didn't have a chance to see it, that he attacked Putin. It said Putin had destroyed Russia, was doing terrible damage to Russia. So who knows what's in his mind? I living in Maryland would be perfectly happy with a deal where you freeze the lines right now. Putin gets the Donbass or whatever. Ukraine takes the rest, and Ukraine is brought into the European Union and not NATO. And I think that would be a decent end or a decent interval right now for neutralizing this conflict. I'd be very happy with that as an external observer and someone who believes in the Ukrainians' right, to their sovereignty and territory. So that's my take.
So there's a scenario in which under Trump, the war in Ukraine ends, relations with China get better, and conceivably things in the Middle East look at least a little better than they've been looking. Not that that's a high bar, God knows, given last year, but there's a scenario.
Go back to, just to pick up on that, Bob, I mean, this is an argument I was making, before. One of the arguments I made is what was going on in the world on October 6th, 2023. Basically, Ukraine was trying to join the West, and Israel was trying to join the East. Israel was trying to normalize with Saudi Arabia. Ukraine was trying to join the European Union. That was both were interrupted, okay, by these two events, by actors who thought that was not in their interests, okay? Hamas and Iran on one side and Russia on another. The sooner we get back to that agenda, my European Union view of the world, of both Europe and the Middle East, the better we are. Now, I understand Russia has interests. Russia's there. It's a big power. Putin is going to have to be satisfied in some way. If you can freeze the lines where they are right now, have some kind of security understanding, get Ukraine into the EU, I think that's not a bad outcome given the many alternatives. Ditto in the Middle East. If you can basically get rid of this Israeli government, open negotiation with the Palestinians, normalize between Israel and Saudi Arabia, things will be tilted in a much better direction.
Okay. So you got to go this minute, right? We have to end this.
No,
now.
you can go on. I got, if there's something
Okay,
else.
I want to plant a seed in your ear here.
Please.
If that's a bad metaphor,
Go
but
ahead.
I want to plant something in your brain. There's a point I've been trying to emphasize that has not gotten wide circulation in the national security establishment, and it was affirmed happily by a guy named Paul Triolo. I don't know if you know him. He's a China technology expert at Albright Stonebridge, and he really knows what he's talking. But the point is this: the chip war. Biden's chip war is increasing the chances of war with Taiwan. I apologize to all the listeners who have already heard this. You can click stop now. You've heard this. That's
I want to hear it. I haven't heard
no.
it.
Okay, so before the chip war, you had these factories in Taiwan, the only factories that produce the most powerful chips in the world, these AI chips, and these chips were going to both China and the West. Okay. And China knew that if there's a war in Taiwan, these factories are probably going to get enduringly disabled. And by the way, it isn't just that if China takes Taiwan, the U.S. is going to bomb them on the way out, which might well happen. But it turns out that these factories are dependent on like ongoing tech support, like remotely from the Netherlands, because they make the chip making equipment. Okay. So the West would have the power to just pull the plug nonviolently on these factories. Now, and just, and China knows that. And as long as China was getting these high-powered chips, that was a deterrent to invasion. But now we've created a situation where they're not getting the chips, only the West is. So obviously, whatever the disincentive for China to invade was has dropped, right? Straight logic. And a lot of people I've talked to say, yeah, I concede the point. But like, nobody's talking about, I mean, the chip war has so many unknowns, and will it work, won't it work? This is like the clearest implication of it, is that China has less to lose from invading Taiwan than it had before. And by the way, the chip war has spurred them to accelerate the development of their indigenous chip making capacity. So it's already getting to the point where all the chips that aren't the most powerful in the world, they're going to have the capacity to make themselves. And so, to me, the thing that most annoys me is just like, what does it say about a foreign policy discourse that nobody mentions this in like, and I'm counting on you to mention it. I'm counting on you to mention it.
Yeah, well, I'm the most, as you know, it's one of the things that we share in common. I'm the most non-zero person in the world. I mean,
I know.
And I'm just utterly despondent about the way the world is going. People, I'm Mr. Globalization and all that bullshit and McDonald's theory and all this stuff. Excuse me, as epics in history go, 1945, okay, to 2023 was one of the better ones. Not perfect. There's no such thing as perfect, but there was more peace and more prosperity for more people, relatively speaking, than a lot of other periods in history. And you're going to miss it when it's gone. Okay. And so everything I do is tied to that reality, because that's when I basically had my career. I grew up in Minnesota. This is when the world I got to cover. And so I've been against all of these things. But what's actually happening is exactly right. Huawei just said, okay, we're going to double down. Huawei's building a giant innovation center right now in Shenzhen. They're just going to double down. Okay, they won't have 2-nanometer chips. Maybe they'll have 7, whatever. But they might get there a little later, a little slower, but it's not going to have that effect. Now, there's one thing I have to say, though, in defense of our guys, that a lot of this started with Xi Jinping. Because you remember in 2015, he comes out with China 2025. It basically says, we are going to own every advanced industry in the world, material science, aerospace, chip making, everything. And our government is going to spend trillions of dollars enabling our companies to do that. That also freaked out a lot of people here. The thing Xi Jinping didn't understand, Bob, and this is a very non-zero thought, okay, is that when the world moves from analog to digital, trust matters more than ever. What do I
Hmm.
mean? In an analog world, when we were buying solar panels and tennis shoes from China, things that were what I call shallow goods that were external to us, I didn't really care whether China was authoritarian, libertarian, or vegetarian, okay? Because these things were external to me. But when you ask me to buy your TikTok or your autonomous car that's just a cell phone data collector on wheels, then shared values matter,
Hmm.
okay? Then what you think, feel, believe, and aspire to matters. And what Xi Jinping's great mistake is, he broke trust with the world right when trust mattered more than ever.
Yeah, there's quickly another sense in which trust matters is if you look at AI and compare it to say nuclear weapons, and it has some of that power. You'd like
Yeah,
to kind of know what's going on in these different
yeah.
countries. It's not you can't regulate it as simply as an arms control agreement regulates nuclear power. Things like transparency and trust and norms are going to matter. And I'd like to see actual regulation, international regulation. I hope we see some, but you
So can I
know,
just say, I mean, we're so in violent agreement on this that I actually I did 2 columns from China, and the second one I went to Shanghai to the hotel where Nixon and Zhou Enlai signed the Shanghai Protocol, and I went there for a reason to say we need a new Shanghai Protocol that has to cover 3 new transnational issues that are not about trade or Taiwan. They're about governing AI, that the 2 AI superpowers have got to create a regime actually for enabling every AI system not to go rogue, okay,
yeah.
or be used by rogues. It starts with us. We need an agreement on climate, and we need an agreement as the 2 biggest climate emitters and as the 2 biggest navies in the world, naval powers in the world. We need an agreement on disorder because I think for the AI reasons and the climate reasons, we're going to see a lot more disorder. My view of Israel is to wider trends in civilization what off Broadway is to Broadway. So a lot of stuff happens in miniature between relations between Israel and its neighbors. Sort of, it's an interface sort of between the West and the East.
Hmm.
And what's happening right now? Israel's actually surrounded by failed and failing states. Okay, that's a mini version of what we've got going in Latin America. I think we're going to see a lot more of that. It's going to be a lot harder to be a country going forward. Okay, so China and America now, if you put trade in Taiwan over on one side, competitive, hostile, over here, governing AI, managing climate change so we can manage what we can't avoid and avoid what we can't manage,
Hmm.
and dealing with disorder, we now have 3 issues that are very important that we get aligned on. And I'm just waiting to see when and if the diplomacy catches up to that.
It's depressing. It didn't have to be this way,
No.
and maybe there is hope. Yeah. And by the way, I would say, when they say, well, we can walk and chew gum at the same time, we can be very hostile toward China and have these agreements. I think that's actually truer with climate change than with AI. I
Yeah.
think AI is more dependent on a more thoroughly trusting relationship. So just to recap that point about how the chip war actually increased the chance of war in Taiwan. Um, I encourage you to at some point trot that out in your column and change world history. And you don't have to attribute it to me. In fact, I will. What I'll do, I'm going to put the last part of this behind a paywall. Nobody will know. Nobody will know. You don't have to cite
No,
me.
I don't want this bad to pay.
Nobody will
Why did
know.
they
And
get
I
rid
will ask our 2,400 paid subscribers to keep mum
Yes.
and not go online complaining that you stole. It turns out actually this guy Paul Triolo had written it when I brought it up to him when he was on my podcast. He's got the first version of it, I think, in writing. So credit him.
Interesting.
Maybe I'll send you that. But
Please.
it's an important. Anyway, I digress. Thanks so much, Tom. I'm gonna go research the Pulitzer question. If it turns out that somebody won 4, it's my duty as a truth-telling journalist to do a piece on that. Okay, I'm sorry.
Always a pleasure,
Sorry
Bob.
in advance.
And I say this as a subscriber. My 60
You are
bucks or whatever it is.
Tom. You are a paid subscriber.
Yeah, I'm
You
a
feel
paid
free. Hey,
subscriber.
feel free to write that in your column too.
Okay, pal.
All right. Thanks, Tom.
Take care, buddy.